Um, yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for kicking off that recording. Again, thank you for all for joining us for our final series in Neighboring Faiths. And so let us begin with our chalice lighting. And I'm gonna use this one that I used a while back because I don't have another one ready. I was stuck in traffic all day, everyone. I'm so sorry. But by the Reverend Marilyn Sewell, in a very real sense. Oh no, this one doesn't work. Elizabeth, can you do me a favor and help me with the chalice lighting?
Of course. Yes.
This one's about theology and that doesn't work.
Beautiful. I am practicing my supporting role, and am I aiming at something particular, or am I creatively helping in this moment?
I think you should creatively help in this moment.
Oh, those are the best. So yes, I actually am keeping this incredibly brief because I'm so excited about our speaker, Pandit Shyam, this evening. So for our chalice lighting, I will leave us with a very brief statement that I want to credit to the person who initiated it. Please let me know if you know who it is, followed by a moment of silence. So our saying for the evening is, today is a gift. That's why it is called the present. We'll have a moment of silence for a moment.
Thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. So our final Neighboring Faith series is being brought to us by Pandit Shyam Maharaj. I think I said that right. Yes, thank you. Who comes from a lineage of Hindu priests that go back to Nepal and hold on, I'm getting older. Uttar? Is that Uttar?
Uttar.
Okay, thank you. And
Pradesh.
Thank you, India. Sorry for the struggle there. From a young age, Shyam was studying Sanskrit with his grandfather and guru. Once having his I struggled on this one too.
Upanayam
done. Shyam started his formal studies within the priesthood. At the age of 13, Shyam started his practice as a Hindu priest in the California Bay Area. Upon graduating high school, Shyam pursued an associate's degree in philosophy, humanities, and political science. Soon after, Shyam transferred to UCLA to earn a bachelor's in arts and philosophy and study of religion with minors in South Asian linguistics and ethnomusicology. After graduation, Shyam worked as a hospice and healthcare chaplain for several years before answering the call for military chaplaincy. Currently, Shyam continues to practice as Hindu practice, as well as teacher of rising priests. Shyam resides in Atlanta, and for the time being, while he pursues his master's in divinity at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. So thank you so much for that bio for me, Shyam, and welcome to the call. I'll let you say hi before we dive in.
Good evening, everyone. I hope everybody's had an auspicious Tuesday. Weather is warming up, sun is shining, so definitely take a chance to go outside and get some fresh air and enjoy the sun. Just remember your sunblock and avoid anything that's dangerous. So I guess Thomas will put up the PowerPoint now and get started.
Yeah, I'm pulling that up. And
Beautiful.
Here we go. And I don't need to share sound. There's no audio in these files, right?
No audio.
Okay, great. Excellent. All right. Well, I would love to kick us off with one of our questions that was derived as we were planning this series to just ask, to get started, what are the core beliefs or tenets of your faith tradition, including your beliefs about God and the afterlife, and maybe even how these have evolved over time, these beliefs have evolved?
Beautiful. So let's go to the first slide and we will start from there. So I think one of the first things that I would like to address is that Hinduism in itself is a very complex tradition. And the reason being is we cannot pinpoint it to one particular founder. There are numerous saints, there's numerous reformers, numerous commentators, but overall Hinduism as a tradition was started by a series of traditions and beliefs that kind of just got layered on top of each other. And most people assume that these layers kind of stopped after the great saints of the 8th and 9th centuries had written their commentaries. But the fascinating thing is these layers continue to be added onto. So Hinduism that was exclusively in existence 30, 40 years ago has drastically changed to the current date as well. Secondly, it's also important to understand that within Hinduism, those unique layers, there's a lot of tension between culture and what we call perceived religious notions. So a lot of things that are practiced in Hinduism may have more cultural and more local roots, but may not be applicable at the larger scale of the tradition across the board. Because these things, I wouldn't necessarily say they're always in tension. Sometimes they work beautifully, and sometimes they kind of clash, and you get a reform movement that starts, and you have a whole nother sect that's born. But overall, these layers, as we dive into Hinduism, my goal is to paint a picture where they're very difficult to peel apart because the culture and the religion have melded together so well. The second thing about Hinduism is Hinduism as a tradition across the board has different unique abilities. Number one, Hindus do have their unique belief in God, but at the same time, there's various scriptures which allude to God. Then there's an extensive philosophy practice. And within that philosophy, there's a balance that's aiming to balance the human struggle and this appeal of divine nature. And as these things meld on, different layers add to that complexity of that problem. How do we bring it together? Now, to start off with Hinduism, I think the first area to start off is understanding Hinduism across the board has 4 goals in life, which are known as Kama, Artha, Dharma, and Moksha. Kama, it translates to pleasure. Artha translates to work. Dharma translates roughly to duty, and Moksha roughly translates to enlightenment. And now what these 4 terms mean is that these are 4 goals that every Hindu at some point is striving to achieve. So everybody has a sense of pleasure. And it's not just pleasure in a sexual sense, it's pleasure in music, pleasure in the arts, pleasure in food. Then everybody has a duty to work, a sense that we should be working and striving for a better community. Thirdly, duty. Everybody in this world is not free of obligations. So we have duties as friends, as family members, as religious leaders. But more so, this duty becomes very complex when we start breaking it down. So I, as a priest, have a duty to my congregation, but I also have a duty to my parents as their son. I have a duty to my sisters as their brother. I have a duty as a nephew. I have a duty as a student. And how these different levels of dharma interact to create what we know as the individual. Last, the goal in Hinduism is to achieve what's called moksha. Moksha in itself is this state of freedom where the soul completely detaches from the world after fulfilling everything that it had to fulfill and move on and unite with what's called Brahman. And we'll get to Brahman in a little bit. Now, this is where Hinduism becomes very decisive. Within these 4 goals, there's more complexity, right? There's what's called samskaras, certain rites of passage, certain identities that have to be practiced. And then along with that, there's this idea that the soul in Hinduism, which is known as Atman, is an aspect of Brahman. Brahman is this one unchanging reality of supreme consciousness. Everything is within Brahman, and Brahman is within everything, but Brahman is not necessarily everywhere, okay? So this is where the concept, the idea of moksha is where the Atman is striving to get back to its original creator, which is Brahman. And so within this interplay, dharma, artha, and kama are interacting because we have to learn to balance our pleasures, our work, and our duty in order to strive towards Brahman. Lastly, there is the phrase on the PowerPoint, as you can see, Sanatan Dharma, which translates to a timeless or righteous path. Hinduism as a phrase is used to refer to the tradition of India, but Sanatan Dharma is the proper translation of the faith that Hindus use. And it's basically referring to this path. And it's a very complex path. And it's not just a path that anybody walks, it's a path that everyone walks. It's a very inclusive religion. And one of the most fascinating things is, as these layers start to interact in Hinduism, there's vast differentiations that start occurring. So, any questions at this point? That was a lot of information.
You use the word karma, and of course, a lot of us use that word in a more secular way. I'm wondering, you may get to it later, but can you give us the concise definition of what that word means within your faith?
So I use the word kama, K-A-M-A. Kama refers to pleasure. Karma specifically refers to the infinite cycle of our causes and our actions. And I'll get to that in the next slide. Karma and dharma have a very tight interplay. So, any other questions so far? If not, Thomas, can we move to the second slide, please? So in this slide, there's several concepts that I'm going to cover, and then we're going to go back and I'm going to tie them to some of the introductory information that I presented. So dharma, as I translated, was the sense of duty. And over here, it's translated as exceptional conduct. Dharma is this interplay. It is this thing that we're constantly striving for. Dharma represents the duty of every individual, but it also represents the righteous conduct of individuals. Dharma is very innately tied to the concept of karma, which you will see. It's personal accountability through selfless acts. The point of dharma is to free us from our karmic actions. It's to free us from the bonds of the material world. Karma is this infinite cycle that continuously keeps on going. And within Hinduism, karma does not leave anybody free of it. Karma binds everyone. Even the gods are subject to karmic action. Now, karma and dharma are one of the too many parts of the layers that are interconnected, because you do not have your dharma without having your karma, and you don't have your karma without having your dharma. It's important to understand that dharma and karma play off of each other. If you have misconduct and if you do bad things, bad karma accrues, and therefore you stray from your path of dharma. But as you strive for better dharma, you have this mindset that helps develop better karma, and you start moving forward. Secondly, daya and karuna, empathy and compassion. This idea that in Hinduism, Atman is not something that's unique just to humans. It's something that all living beings have. Animals have it, plants have it. They're all part of Brahman. So daya and karuna are meant to exclusively include everyone across the board. This is why you should be respectful to plants, you should be respectful to animals, because they are part of that infinite cycle. And karuna, compassion, very different. Karuna is this concept of where you are identifying with the being and learning to love them, and understanding that as you grow in your dharma, they too are starting to grow in their dharma. Karuna applies to all living beings, all aspects of living life. Ahimsa falls under daya and karuna, and that specifically refers to the sanctity of life. Sanctity of life in Hinduism has been argued in many different ways, but it specifically means, as Gandhi translated, as nonviolence. And nonviolence extends all the way to the smallest animal, all the way to the biggest animal, and to your fellow humans. And by practicing nonviolence, you start extending empathy and compassion to them. And by that means, you develop what's called karma. Again, Karma is a part of the dharmic cycle, and dharma is a part of the karmic cycle. Sewa is this concept of service, the idea that we are connected to our dharma by serving society at large. So within Hinduism, when I was explaining duty, Sewa falls under that concept of duty. And what it specifically refers to is this idea that through our duty, we have obligations towards society, and we should work to fulfill those societies. Upasana and bhakti, which falls into another aspect of philosophy of Hinduism. Upasana is the actual practice, and bhakti translates to devotion. So through practice, one develops this concept of faith. And we have to constantly practice in order to constantly develop our faith. Faith is ever growing, it never ceases. And once you get to that radical level of faith or bhakti, that's when your dharma is at its full level. Lastly, dana, which refers to charity, is this idea that we should, as part of our inner dharma, we should be charitable to the world around us. Now, the Hindu scriptures are not saying that you need to sacrifice your means of life. What the Hindu scriptures are saying across the board is that if we have the means, we should be supporting society at large. And mumukshva is longing to know the larger truth. And within Hinduism, there is this idea that there is a God, and we should strive to understand this God. But more so, the complexity of this world is something that we should strive to know, this eternal truth. And as we strive, as we move into the dharmic cycles, we start to understand this truth as we practice and as we develop forward. Any questions so far?
None in the chat that I see.
I've got one.
Everybody's very silent.
I've got one if I can give one. So on your first slide, you use the designation of Hinduism as a monotheistic religion, but you've also mentioned gods in the plural. So how are we to understand that differentiation?
So this is where we're going to come into the most fun part. I want to back up just a little bit. So everybody has heard at some point or seen the movie The Temple of Doom or whatnot, and they see that Hinduism has this huge pantheon, or you walk into a world market and they have a little Ganesh. Hinduism has a rich pantheon of gods. And the reason this pantheon exists is because of this weaving. You have different gods that come into contact with other gods as different traditions throughout the Indian subcontinent continue to mix. Now, within Hinduism, although we have been described as polytheistic in the past, what Hinduism really is, it is by definition a monotheistic religion. And the reason is that even though of these various gods you may worship one, within the Hindu context, each of those gods are innately related. So if you worship Ganesh, by worshiping Ganesh, you are also worshiping Krishna or Rama or Shiva, because they're all manifestations of that same Brahman that comes into this world. Now, the relationship between Atman and Brahman is where the devotion aspect gets very unique. So in some aspects of Hinduism, you have people who believe in full-on devotion, where we are in service of God, where God has this unique manifested form, and we should celebrate that manifested form. And that is known as Sadhguna Brahman, meaning that Brahman has attributes that we as humans can understand. Then there's another side of Hinduism that says, no. You Sadgunis have it wrong. Brahman is Nirguna, which means it doesn't have attributes that we can truly understand. So we are only striving to know the eternal truth of the world without its actual attributes, because attributes by nature are flawed. And this is a tension that occurs in Hinduism as Hinduism develops as a universal religion within the Indian subcontinent. Now, within the god dynamics, there's 4 sects within Hinduism. It's 4 sectarian divides. The first one is Vaishnava, second one is Shaiv, third one is Samrat, and fourth is called Shaiv. These traditions, or these sectarian divides, as much as they're philosophical, are more rooted in the allegiance to different gods. So the Vaishnav tradition specifically follows the cult of Vishnu and every incarnation that has to do with Vishnu. The Shaiv tradition specifically follows the god Shiva and his manifestations. The Samrat sect is a compilation of the other three, and the fourth one is Shakt, which specifically refers to Durga and Kali. The Samrat takes from all three of them and kind of combines it, but takes this Nirgun Brahman form. So they see they see the gods and the goddesses in their unique forms, but it doesn't necessarily believe or practice. They believe that these are just manifestations that we are worshiping in order to understand the higher calling of God. So I hope that somewhat answers your question, Ada. I know it kind of went a little further than that.
I like that you managed to bring in apophatic and cataphatic theology. So that's very good.
That's my Candler training coming into play. So any other questions so far as we proceed? So Thomas, that kind of answers your basic questions about core beliefs and ideas within Hinduism. The key thing to remember is that in general, we like to refer to Hindus as people who are striving for moksha. And the reason being is because within the Hindu tradition, this world is considered to be an illusion. It's not real. So the Atman, that is an aspect of Brahman, only embodies this body that's in existence. For us, upon death, what ends up happening is the body is confined, but it's the soul that eternally travels. The soul cannot be burnt, it cannot be harmed, it cannot be punished, it cannot get wet, it cannot be dried, because the soul is infinite, just like Brahman, because it is a part of Brahman. And the vehicle, the body is simply a vehicle. There is an old saying that comes from the Bhagavad Gita that says, just as we discard an old pair of clothes and put on a new pair of clothes, such the soul dons one body and lets go of it once it has reached its end and adopts a new one. Now, this is where reincarnation becomes a little complicated. But what ends up happening in the Hindu system is as you accrue good karma, you move up. And so let's say you are doing good karma and you're living up to your dharma and you pass, but you haven't reached the full level. So that good karma and dharma carries over and your Atman lets go of the body, moves into another body upon reincarnation, and it starts on that level again. But let's say you get to this high level and all of a sudden you start doing bad things. And over time, your karma and your dharma both fall. So upon this Atman renouncing that body, dying, the Atman falls back and it gets born again. So within Hinduism, there's this constant cycle of where the Atman is striving to get to Brahman. But because this world is very illusionary and the idea that our senses are very deceptive, the body traps the soul. So the soul gets trapped by pleasure, by the taste of fancy foods, by listening to good music, gets attached to money. And therefore the soul constantly goes up or goes down. And over time, as the soul starts realizing in the body that, oh, these things are useless, the soul eventually gets to a point where it finds moksha, where it frees itself and it unites with Brahman. So uniting with Brahman is the ultimate goal. But at the end of the day, the soul struggles for that. And that's where Hinduism's concept of reincarnation comes into play. Any questions so far?
Yes, we've got a question from Jill and related to this topic. If your soul is returning in a different body, is that body necessarily Hindu? Must it return in a human form? So kind of a two-part question.
Okay. I would love to have an answer for that question, but sadly, I do not. There is a lot of debate within Hinduism as to whether the body or whether the soul comes to a Hindu body or to another body in another tradition. And this has been an ongoing debate for a number of years. That's the answer that I have for that situation as of now. So.
And then Helen was just mentioning that you had also talked about extra things that were not on this slide. And I think, Helen, you're probably just making sure that I didn't miss moving to a new slide or something, or.
No, when I was talking about the concepts of karma, dharma, artha, and moksha, that was just kind of give a general background, and that's referring to the core beliefs of what within Hinduism is. I didn't include that on the PowerPoint because I kind of like to give that as an introduction, but I can always type out the words and go from there. So
Great. So we could, you think we would want to move on to the next question, or did you want to keep going with,
let's move on to the next question.
Okay. So our next question really is around how you educate I don't know if you call the people within, we're a congregation, right? I'm not sure what you call the people that would go to your services, but how do you educate your participants along the lifespan, or your congregation along their lifespan of coming to, of being in your religion? And then like, what are the core topics you cover with children and youth, or and what is the focus of study with adults? Like, how is your education process?
So within the role of the temple within Hinduism is a very unique one. So, and just to give a little bit of background, the temple plays a very important role when it comes to festivities, huge celebrations such as weddings, or the marking of a sacrament such as weddings or baptisms, or the birth of a new child. But for the most part, a lot of Hindus nowadays will generally have an altar in their own home. And this is where I'm going to try to give a very basic answer, but you will see that my question is going to address the many different layers that I was mentioning earlier. So depending on which part of India you are from, there's various different roles of the temple, right? Some people use the temple as a daily basis where, you can go every day, pay your respects to the gods, meet with the priest, sit, hang out, whatnot. But there's no actual fixed day at which the congregation goes to the temple. And I'm using the word congregation just to refer to the people who go to any particular Hindu temple. Usually the group that goes to the temple, we use the word satsang. And the word satsang is the gathering of devotees and believers to talk about God, to hear sermon, to sing hymns, to participate in a festival, to just come together as a community to celebrate whatever the temple may be hosting. But for clarification, I'm just going to use congregation because it works better. When it comes to the education within the Hindu system, that's solely dependent on the family and their cultural tradition which they come from. So from a personal experience, I grew up in a Nepali and Uttar Pradeshi family, and specifically a priest family. So our traditions, our practices are mainly rooted around reading scripture, learning to talk about it, learning the mythologies and the various different layers of the mythologies, learning rituals. But for another Hindu, that may necessarily not be the case. Some Hindus may only refer to their tradition when they're referring to a sacrament. And what I mean by sacrament is a birth of a child, initiating of someone, a wedding, or a funeral. So that answer really varies depending on who you're talking to. But the general consensus around priests within the temple is when we are educating our congregation, we're pushing people to strive for a better karmic life. So respect the life around you, value the individuals, respect your elders, don't pollute the earth, don't use bad language, be respectful, be present. And through that presence, you accrue good karma in hopes to find moksha. The other side of it, though, is when you have a tradition that's rooted in lots of rituals and practices, a lot of families will use the rituals as a way to get the family involved. So, for example, a basic ritual such as a Satyanarayanjika Katha will consist of a family getting together to celebrate Vishnu. And in that ritual, it may be getting all the prayer rituals together, it may be the singing of hymns, it may be sitting there and engaging with the priest, or I may just be sitting there and observing the ritual. That depends, as I said, depending on the cultural aspect of Hinduism, which part of India you come from, what tradition your family follows, and whatnot. When it comes to children, we like to share the stories of the epics of the Ramcharitramanas, which is this narrative of Ram, his story of how he was born a prince, goes into exile, his wife gets kidnapped, and so he defeats a demon to bring her back, and then he comes back to be crowned king, and the interplay of who he gets help from on this journey. Or the story of the Mahabharata, where there is two cousin brothers fighting for a kingdom, and how we should learn to balance and we should not be greedy. These are two common scriptures that are used. Supplementing them could be the Bhagavad Gita, could be any of the Upanishads, could be any of the Vedic suktams. It's really open to the family, to be very honest. And that's where the various layers really become complex. When it comes to adults, being a priest here in the United States, one of the largest conversations we've been having is about transitions. Hinduism is a tradition that in the past saw death as a relief because the soul is now moving on. The Atman is now free of this body. So now a lot of the education with adults is, number one, about the history of Hinduism as an overall. So where we exist as a cultural tradition, but where we also exist as a religious tradition, but also being able to provide pastoral care. So sitting with families and getting them to talk about grief, getting them to talk about the scriptures that they're studying, or even simply talking about one of the stories they heard as a child about Ram and how that relates to their personal narrative. This is where, again, as I said, the layers become very interactive, because how I experience scripture and the tradition will be very different than how one of my cousins would experience it because of our different approaches to life. And that's where Hinduism gives a lot of leeway as a tradition to let people pick and choose what they want. So does that answer your question, Thomas?
I think that was a good overview of it. I would be interested if anyone has any follow-up questions to that. There was one in the chat, and I'll go to that if no one wants to come off mute and has any questions right now. Someone asked in the chat, can you explain the role of any monastic communities within Hinduism, and how common is it for people to live in religious communities? Do others visit ashrams for spiritual retreats or other purposes? So it's like 3 questions, kind of.
Okay. So coming back, within Hinduism, there's 4 phases of everybody's life. And this is childhood, marriage, old age, and renouncement. And generally the monastic order is reserved for people who either have a really intense religious calling, and there was several famous monastics. Adi Shankaracharya was one of them, who was famous for writing commentaries on several of the Upanishads. And then there's Ramanujacharya, who started the sect that I follow. They were profoundly called to God. Essentially, they took renouncement from a very early age. Now, the role of monastics in Hinduism is very different than the role of a priest. A monastic in Hinduism will never officiate any rituals, will never preside. They will attend, because a monastic is somebody who has given up their full identity within the world. So within Hindu monastic rites, when somebody decides to take monastic vows, they will perform what's called Shraddha. And Shraddha is they will essentially do a funeral rite for their own name and their identity. So they give that identity completely up and they go off and they live in the world. Monastics can be of 2 functionings. One is there's monastics who write commentaries, who preach, who teach, but they don't perform rituals. Or the second one is the monastic who just decides to devote their life to yoga and meditation. India has had, and Hinduism has had, a vast amount of both of them. Several of them have made their way into the West. Swami Chinmaya, Swami Vivekananda, Srila Prabhupada, who was the founder of the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. Each of the monastics have a different role. Now, generally in the United States, most Hindus, when they do go back to India or where their families are, the ashram or the monastic location would be a place of visiting or maybe taking temporary relief as they're on a pilgrimage. But for the most part, the monastic order is one of discipline and academia across the board. It's people who are 100% invested in the tradition, either trying to meditate, realize God, denounce their body, or people who are going in to study the tradition and understand the philosophies at a deeper level. And that's by sitting and studying the commentaries of several people who have come up in the past. Now, the other side of the monastic tradition is people do visit ashrams. And the reason that they'll visit ashrams is because they may have a particular spiritual leader that they're connected to. So depending on which secretarian divide you follow along, you will go to a particular ashram of that teacher or that guru and spend some time with them studying, learning meditation, gaining some kind of personal insight. That relationship is encouraged, actually. The monastic order is seen as an order that guides the people moving forward. So I hope that someone answers the question. We can get into the nuances of the monastic order, but that's another like 2-hour lecture on its own. So
Hopefully that was a great response for the person that asked that. There's a question on reincarnation again, on if someone can be reincarnated as an animal or a plant.
So this has been one of my personal research areas. Within the Hindu Puranas, the narratives of the gods and the various kings and rulers of India, there are numerous stories about people who died and came back as an elephant, as a dog, or as a plant. Now, there's also a lot of debate about whether or not the soul actually comes back as a human, animal, or a plant, depending on the karmic actions. And the general consensus tends to be is if your karmic actions are so severe and so bad, then you can possibly get reincarnated into the life of, let's say, a bug, an ant, a snail, something that compared to the human standard has a very miserable life. In some cases, you may be lucky enough to be born as a plant. But this is something that's been going back and forth on. The general consensus is as you are moving forward in the concept of karma and dharmic action, you get reincarnated, you get upgraded within human bodies. But if you do fall back and it's not that far of a fall, you can still come back as a human. But if the fall is big enough to, let's say, there's a very big example where it says that a person who kills an animal directly will most likely get reincarnated as that animal themselves because of the heinousness of that crime. But again, it's really dependent on the nature of karma and the nature of your dharma as well. So it's a very vague answer to something that's, again, within Hinduism, still kind of contested. So. See, we have more questions.
Sorry, I was on mute. I said, Kay, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah. I can think of so many hundreds of questions right now, but one of them that just sprung in as you were talking about that is it seems to me that if you had some concept that you could come back as a plant, then trees which live for past human beings, it seems to me that there would be some temptation or some urge or some logic to think of those as like they've reached like a higher than a human life kind of, because their souls reach something higher than a human life.
So if I'm understanding your question, it's the idea that the tree may have a better soul or quality of soul and body than a human life. Within Hinduism, not necessarily. So within Hinduism, the human state is the ideal state that everyone should strive for, because this is the most capable identity of the Atman that can strive to understand Brahman. It is the most conscious, it is the most connected, it is the most alert.
And so all of the gods, Krishna and all the other ones, if there was some tree that could assume that they would, that's, you know, I can see that there aren't any gods that I'm aware of in the Hindu that are inanimate.
Inanimate, and you mean by that have human nature or animal nature? Okay.
Yeah.
Within the Hindu pantheon, there are actually quite a few. So within Vishnu's incarnations, you have Narasimha Swami, who is half man, half lion. You also have Matsya, who takes the form of a fish. You have Kurma, who takes the form of a tortoise, not a turtle. And it's hard to compare within Hinduism the incarnations of the human going into a different body, or the Atman going into another body, versus the gods going into another body. The concept of incarnation within Hinduism is one where once the god takes incarnation, they voluntarily renounce their body, and therefore they go and unite with Brahman or into their final form, which in the case of Krishna, he goes back to being Krishna in the universal form versus just being Krishna on earth. The gods do not incarnate or reincarnate, they only incarnate, and that is per their discretion. If that answers your question.
Yep, thanks.
Perfect.
I think I accidentally changed slides, but I guess it's fine being on this one. Sorry about that. But Joyce has her hand up.
No worries.
Hi. So,
Hello.
do you believe that reincarnation happens to everyone regardless of their faith, or does it only happen to people who believe in it?
So this is, again, one of the debates that's been going on in Hinduism is, if you are reincarnated, can you be reincarnated in another faith tradition? And this is something that there's really no consensus on. Me personally, it's kind of out of the scope of the presentation for me today. But for across the board, it generally is the idea that anybody can be reincarnated. Everybody here is going through a reincarnation cycle. That's the universal belief within Hinduism.
I did like your question in chat too, Joyce, of can someone convert to Hinduism? Like if you marry someone, is that possible?
Yes, that's actually very much possible. Within Hinduism, anybody is welcome to the tradition to explore it. That is at the discretion of who you may get married to, their cultural, their religious practices, which temple. There's, you know, multiple layers when it comes to that conversation.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And now, what are some common misconceptions about Hinduism that you've seen?
Oh, this should be very fun. One of the biggest misconceptions is going back to this idea that Hinduism is polytheistic. And the reason being is that people read the Hindu Puranas, which is the narratives on the various gods, and they think that it's just this huge pantheon of just the gods doing whatever. But in reality, as I said earlier, in Hinduism, each of the gods are different manifestations of Brahman. So because I worship Krishna doesn't necessarily mean, you know, I'm not worshiping other gods. What it means is through Krishna, all the other gods exist in existence as well. Now they exist as separate incarnations which interact, but within Hinduism, all of those incarnations are manifestations of the one. So in that essence, it's very much monotheistic because people have their one particular god they're affiliated with. My second biggest misconception that people tend to have about Hinduism is that all Hindus are vegetarian. Actually, not necessarily. A lot of Hindus within certain contexts are actually not vegetarian, and they will eat chicken, whatnot. Besides beef and pork, beef because cows are considered sacred, and pork because pigs are considered to be impure. But this idea that Hindus are universally just vegetarian. My third favorite misconception of Hinduism, which has been one that we've thought, is that we're all just, a bunch of yoga and mindfulness practitioners, and we really don't care because we have karma to fall back on. Not at all. Hinduism within itself is a very complex tradition of various philosophies, different ideas, different interpretations, a lot of tensions between ideas and concepts. And as much as it is a belief and a practice of a tradition where people worship, believe in God, practice rituals, it is also a very rich philosophical tradition in itself, where there's concepts, there's debates about the concept of evil, the concept of what our karma means, what dharma really represents. Is worship needed? What is the point of yoga? What is the point of meditation? These are reflections that are found within the various narratives of Hinduism in its various layers. But this idea that, Hindus are just kind of like floating around on a cloud and very happy with life, no, Hinduism is very attuned with the sufferings of the world and its various manifestations. So that's one of my personal favorite questions. If we were in person, I would have had slides for Temple of Doom and, the Guru, different movies that have kind of misrepresented what Hinduism is as a tradition. So.
Looks like Kay and Joyce again. Kay?
Is the caste system in India purely cultural, or does it have elements of Hindu?
The one question that I was waiting for. So thank you for bringing that up. The caste system in very many ways is still rooted in cultural and religious practices of Hinduism. And this is one of the most interesting parts, because we see layers of Hinduism that have these unique and very intense manifestations about people's roles and identities in society. But then you also have religious expectations of individuals that have started to mix with it, which has created a lot of dialogue and a lot of tension around the concept of the caste system. I would argue, and this is me as an academic, I would argue it's a mixture of both. And that's simply the best way to have that conversation, simply because, as I was saying about the layers, as we start peeling the layers back within Hinduism, we start realizing that, oh, wow, we got one layer off. Oh, great, there's another 50 to go. And the caste system is definitely one of those that sociologically has to be peeled back in order to understand a little bit more. It has definitely been used for misappropriation and disregard of individuals. It has also been used to prevent people from having access. But at the same time, it's also rooted in a lot of cultural misperceptions and perceptions that kind of mixed over several generations. I hope that answers your question.
It does, and it reminds me of, Christianity and slaves and your question about the gods. I mean, we have 3 gods, Christians do. So there's that. They're manifestations, same thing, manifestations of the one God.
Yeah.
That all seems very familiar.
Yeah.
And then Joyce, you had a question.
So you briefly mentioned yoga, and somebody in the chat asked about yoga too. How do you feel about modern Western use of yoga, and specifically the word namaste?
I think that's a question I'm not going to answer, because it's one of those things that I feel that will take us onto a completely different trajectory. And I feel like me personally, I do have my own thoughts about it, but it's not necessarily something that's really within the narrative of today, because that gets into cultural misappropriation and whatnot. I'm going to leave it at that.
I mean, that's why I'm asking. I want to know, if,
Right.
people are using it correctly or incorrectly, and I suspect not.
Again, it's something that I can definitely speak to, but within the concept of what your interfaith speaker series is about, it's something that kind of takes me a little bit away from what I'm actually here to talk about. So, but yeah, that is a very interesting conversation on its own.
Thank you.
There was one that I missed from someone that said, can you tell us how the Hare Krishna movement intersects with Hinduism?
So the Hare Krishna the Hare Krishna organization is one that breaks off from the Sri Vaishnav Sampradaya, which is the larger sect of Vishnu followers. And they are firm believers in the incarnation of Krishna and the idea that chanting of Krishna's name is what frees us from this material world. When it comes to their interaction with Hinduism as an overall tradition, they are what we would call a reform response, breaking away from issues within a caste system, breaking away within access to God, and more so the role of spiritual masters in helping a person find God. To get a little bit more information about that, you would have to spend some time reading ISKCON's perspectives. ISKCON they're very much within their own rights. And so they have their own criticisms, which is why I would classify them as a reform movement, but within the tradition across the board, they may not see themselves as that way.
And checking if I've missed any other ones. There's a couple down here.
We didn't need the PowerPoint after all.
And is there anything else on it I should share, or should I take it down so we can just see each other while we are chatting?
Let's take it down and let's go face to face.
Yeah, that way we can just see you better, and you can be the focus for us. So there's a few more questions in chat here. Let's see. A lot going on in chat for me. If you were functioning in a pastoral role, how would you provide care for someone who fears they have accrued an excess of negative karma?
I take it that question's from Aiden.
It is.
So this is where there's a lot of rituals which help balance a person's soul out. So in the case that somebody who is dying or really scared of them passing on, there are a series of rituals that a priest will prescribe as a means to help the person find inner peace. The second thing is providing them with presence. And what I mean by that is getting a person to acknowledge the fact that they have strayed away from the karmic and dharmic paths. Within Hinduism, there's a lot of individual perspectives as to what a person should do when they realize if they've had bad karma. And most people say the most reasonable answer that we've come across is that if you come to it at an early point in life and you're still able to live a long and fruitful life, change yourself instantly so you can grow, learn, and move forward. At the end of life, the thing that most Hindu priests will prescribe is the chanting of any of the particular deities' names or the giving away of donations, dana, which is, whether it's donating money to the homeless or feeding food to the homeless, anything that can accrue auspicious karma. And donation is considered to be one of the most pious ways to do that, and chanting of the Lord's name. In the pastoral setting, generally, it's more about getting the person to open up and relieve themselves of the sins that they may have committed and getting them to talk about it and acknowledge them and make them present, and then working on a process of healing from there. And depending on the timeline, that can take anywhere from a couple of days to a few weeks to a month to even years. If the person is dying, then it's generally to get the person to kind of open up, chant God's name, give a donation to something, and then move forward from there.
Somebody said, I've read about Hinduism as part of an introduction to different beliefs or religions. You've gone deeper than it did in a much clearer way. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thought I'd pay you a little compliment there from someone. I'm
accruing good karma in that regard.
That's great. And somebody said, I have a friend who self-identifies as Hindu, but does not believe there are Devas and Devis. I think I'm mispronouncing that. I'm sorry. He subscribes to the philosophical elements, quote unquote, philosophical elements like oneness, but doesn't think other supernatural parts are necessary for his beliefs. What do you think of this? Can people pick and choose elements of Hindu belief, or is it necessary to subscribe to a more comprehensive belief system?
I would answer the question by asking, do you believe that people can do that with other traditions? And if the answer is yes, then generally you will find that in Hinduism as well. And the best way to explain it is, I keep on going back to the layers. There's a lot of Hindus within the community who believe in the whole pantheon and various rituals and practices and whatnot. But at the same time, there may be Hindus out there who only believe in the oneness of everything, that they have a duty to serve the world and whatnot. And then other people believe that, I should go about doing my life and just try to be a good person. And I'm technically still a Hindu. Yes. Hinduism has this unique ability as a tradition where people, as they mold their own beliefs and come to understand their connection to the world, they add on to the layers of the diversity. And there's quite a few Hindus who follow in that track, and they follow within what's called the Advaita Vedanta tradition, which was codified by Adi Shankaracharya, who talked about the oneness of the world. This idea that we are also Brahman and we should strive to be free from these things. We don't necessarily need all the luxurious rituals and practices around us, as long as we're striving to be a better person inside and we remember that we are part of the thing that created us. So those layers only pile on over time. So yes, somebody could definitely be a Hindu while not subscribing to a lot of aspects of it. It's what makes diversity within our tradition so fun. It's kind of, the way I like to describe it is, it's kind of like a banquet when you go and you serve yourself and you take the foods that you like and you don't eat the foods you don't want. Dharma allows us to pick those things that allow us to improve as a person. And there's definitely a lot of room for that within the Hindu tradition as a whole.
I think that is all the chat questions. Did I miss anyone's chat question? If I did,
Yes, you did.
please let me know. Oh, I'm looking. Sorry.
There's one from Pat Mitchell.
Yeah, the monastic communities. That was
No.
one.
The one I was looking at says, from Pat Mitchell, practically how do Hindus put nonviolence into practice? Do they participate in militaries? Do they support capital punishment, abortion? Maybe Pat Mitchell would want to speak to it. But anyway, that's the question.
Yep, I found it now. Thanks so much. Yep.
No worries. Thank you for sharing that. This is where Dharma becomes a very, very engaged practice. Hinduism, as much as it believes in nonviolence within the scriptures, for example, the Mahabharata, and even the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna encourages Arjuna to fight. The war he is fighting is one of righteousness, where he is fighting to get his kingdom back, to avenge his people who have been mistreated and whatnot. So there is definitely a lot of leeway within the dharmic tradition itself to kind of figure out where we're going with certain things. Now with Hinduism coming into more contact with the Western world, there is more conversations on the table about what is the Hindu belief on abortion? What is the Hindu belief of military wars? Is a war justified? You know, even everything from same-sex marriage to transgender identity. These are things that are now being introduced within Hinduism. And Hinduism as a tradition, because of its many layers, is now starting to incorporate these into the conversation. Part of my role as a priest is to engage these conversations. And one of the things that I'm learning very quickly in my own practice is that as a person who is within this tradition, I have to be prepared to engage with this material across the board. And it's because my calling as a priest is to be able to provide spiritual care and pastoral care to anyone, because that is within my dharma. And so as the tradition continues to grow and include various other narratives and so many more people in the conversation, these conversations are now becoming highlighted and they're becoming crucial, and we're developing it. You know, there is this concept of identity, there is this concept of war, there is people fighting for their lives. What does this mean within the Hindu context? And to give you the most practical answer I can give you is Hinduism is engaging. There's now active members who are leaders within the tradition who are asking these questions, not just within the academic sense, but in the very practical sense. And now there's a push, for example, when we talk about abortion, you know, it's not just a bunch of priests who are sitting around and talking about it, it's women. And so how do we as priests empower the women to be able to speak about these subjects? Well, it's requiring us to step away and let women take dominance in those narratives. And so as these conversations are happening, you're seeing the layers continue to add on. And so the answer, as I said, is we are engaging wholeheartedly.
Great, thank you for that. And sorry I missed that question, Pat. Are women able to be Hindu priests?
Yes, this is one of the more prevalent movements that is coming out of India. You have a role of women who have gone through the studies and have actually started to act as priests. And they are, in some parts of India, they're not welcomed. But here in the United States, we're starting to see a growth in the number of women who are coming into the priesthood. And it's something that's being embraced because men can't always go into certain areas. So there is definitely, at a practical level, this melding of boundaries where traditionally women would not have become priests, but now you have women who are coming into the ministry. Whether it's coming in as a Hindu chaplain or coming in as a Hindu priest really depends on the congregation and the cultural background which they come from. Whether
Thank you. And Kay has your hand, you have your hand up again. Nope, you're still on mute, Kay.
Where are the ethnic Hindus other than India? Because I know there's some culturally Muslim people in India. And the Indians have spread around the world and are now in like 4th and 5th and 6th generation places,
Yep.
like the Caribbean and United States. But what other cultures is there any other culture aside from the Indian that has a history of that?
So Indians, when it comes to the Indian diaspora, there's actually quite a lot. One of the largest Indian communities that exists outside of India would be found in South Africa, Mauritius, Uganda, Kenya, those places. The Caribbean is another very big one, Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana. The other big one where my family is actually very well connected is Fiji. I am technically first generation born in the United States, but my parents were third generation born in Fiji. And this has been another really, really engaging part of Hinduism, because you see how Hinduism as a tradition went to these countries, you know, as for obviously for colonialist reasons, but how they survived and persisted and adapted. And the similarities between, for example, Fijian Indians and Guyanese and the Caribbean Hindus versus the Hindus in South Africa. Also, at the same time, it is within the diaspora communities that we're starting to see more conversations about the practicality of our religious practices and beliefs. And this has been an ongoing dialogue. You know, for example, within Fijian Indian society, a lot of Fijian Indians and Hindus still speak Hindi and can read it and write it. So the Hindi there has taken a very distinct form, and how that Hindi is different compared to the vernacular Hindi of India, or even the academic Hindi, and how that impacts the preservation of the culture, the transference of the culture. At the same time, it's also the individual roles of people. You know, within diaspora communities, there's a bending of religious ritual and practices that kind of adapts to the culture that was in existence right then and there. You know, not everything was always available when they first arrived in Fiji, Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana. So that's actually been a huge conversation as well. But yeah, you're talking fourth and fifth generations in Fiji, South Africa, Mauritius, Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago. So.
In the United States?
United States, I don't have an answer for that one, because you have, like, for example, technically within the diaspora community, I'm first generation Indo-Fijian. You know, family is Indo-Fijian, but first generation born here. So technically I am first generation here, but then you have families who have been here as early as the 60s and 70s. Swami Vivekananda came in the early 1900s and spoke at the World Parliament of Religions. So there may have been Hindus there. There may have been other Hindus who came here through other connections. That would be more of a sociological research project, something I haven't really spent much time looking into.
I've got one more question that's popped up in here. Can you explain the rituals or practices around surrounding death in Hinduism? And that might be our last one for the night, depending on how long this one takes.
No worries. So generally when a person is known to start dying, what the family will do is they will bathe the person, put them on a clean sheet, clean clothes, clean place, and the chanting of Krishna's name or Vishnu's name, whichever deity is preferred by that person or that family, will start being praised. Usually at that time, the family will, if they want, they will sometimes call a priest, sometimes they won't. The priest will come and provide like a blessing, the drinking of holy water, which may be from the sacred rivers in India, Ganga, Jamuna, Saraswati, wherever, whatnot. Upon the death of a person, usually in India and other places, it's cremation as fast as possible. But what ends up happening here, just to give a quick rundown, is the body is prepared for the funeral. And the day of the funeral, what ends up happening is 5 rice balls are made. Of those 5 rice balls, they're made as offerings to the various locations where the body will rest. So where the person died, where the body is resting now, the doorway which the body will travel through on its way to cremation, on the path to cremation, and then at the cremation location. And at the cremation location, what will happen is the eldest son will, with the guidance of a priest, will invoke a ritual fire, which will, several offerings will be made, because the human body is to be confined to fire. So it can be returned to its 5 natural elements: earth, fire, water, air, and ether, which we translate as space. That's generally the Hindu practice around funerals. Now, what ends up happening is from the day of the funeral, we count 10 days. Now the soul has no body. So what ends up happening at this point is there's rice balls that are offered all the way leading up to the 10th day to give the soul a temporary body as it begins its journey. On the 10th day, the final rice ball is offered. And in that rice ball, the person who has passed, they're also mixed in with their ancestors. So their presence that was known as like so-and-so, like me, I would be mixing with my father, my grandfather and whatnot through that rice ball. Then on the 11th day is the final offering of the rice balls, which is called Ekodash. And that's another series of 11 rice balls that are offered to kind of help the soul move on its journey. On the 12th day, there's a series of gifts that are given to the various priests that are involved and to various temple organizations and whoever. And then on the 13th day, there's a ritual done where fire is invoked and several offerings are made to the different gods to mark the official journey of the soul on its way to the kingdom of death as it's getting ready to be judged for its karma and its karmic actions. And once again, this has kind of been my somewhat phrase over the night. Those traditions also depend on the individual families and where they grew up. Some Hindus do still practice burial. Some Hindus are now opening up to what's called what's his name? Desmond Tutu had this ritual done, the aquamation process. Some Hindus are opening up to the donation of the body to science. So it really just depends. But those rites that I gave you are the general practices from the moment somebody is dying until after they've passed. One of my areas that I love to talk about. So. Any other questions, comments, concerns, Thomas?
So
When
I
you talk,
think-
when you say the rice balls are given, are they burnt or are they eaten or are they?
So they are made
Mhm.
literally just rice flour mixed with milk and black sesame seed, and they're placed out. The ones that are put on the day of the funeral are usually put with the body when it's put for cremation. The ones offered after that are either confined to water or they're left out and out open for animals to eat. So.
Any other questions before I was gonna cut off questions and wrap things up around 8:50. So we've got about 4 more minutes to chat if anybody has any last minute questions. Kay, you said you had hundreds in your head, so you can keep going. You can keep going if no one else has questions.
I was, well, so much of it is like Christianity in that there's so many sects and so many, and then, the education of the Christian, if you ask how the Christian, if you use the word Christian as opposed to each particular denomination, the answers are all different. How do you educate your kids? How do you, what rituals do you perform, which even what holidays you have. So that makes perfect sense to me. And so many of them are culturally based. So that all seems very understandable.
I see
thought of
Anne.
something. We had a talk from a gentleman who talked to us about Sikhism, and those people that follow that religious practice are also from India. Is there any relationship between Sikhism and Hinduism?
There's actually Sikhism actually rose out of the conflicts between Islam and Hinduism as a tradition. And Guru Nanak is actually praised as a great reformer and pusher away of all not even this understanding that we are all human, and we're all striving for God, and we should, the concept of Hinduism and Sewa and Sikhism are somewhat similar, not exactly, but Sikhism is birthed out of the conflicts between two major religions in India, which were Hinduism and Sikhism. So.
Thank you.
Well, I echo what somebody just put in chat. Thank you for an excellent presentation and discussion. So, a fun thing for everyone is we're doing a community class on visiting our faith neighbors, and you actually can take a guided tour of a Hindu mandir this Saturday, April 16th at 10:30 a.m. Our adult religious education team is going to be going on a guided tour of the BAPS or maybe BAPS, Sri
Swami Narayan, Narayan
Narayan. There we go.
in Tucker.
Mandir, which is in Lilburn, Georgia. And you can email us at communityclass@uuca.org to RSVP and to arrange a carpool if needed. I'm just going to go ahead and put this in the chat as well so that you have that email address handy.
And when you go, make sure you eat food. Indian food is, temple food is delicious.
Now you're making me want to really go because I love Indian food. So I can't imagine. I bet it's a lot better than Barwachi up the street from me. So, which I love Barwachi. I don't. So yes, please join us this weekend. And also since this is the last part of our series. Wait, I just want to make sure there was some chats that came in. Oh yeah, okay. Everybody's thanking you. We have next week we have a break from our adult religious education classes, and so that's the 19th. There will be no class next Tuesday, and then we have a 4-part series starting on gentrification that begins on Tuesday the 26th, which will kick off that 4-part series starting April 26th and goes on through May. So be sure to join us for that. But if this reminder pops up on your calendar next week, just remember we don't have a class next week. Also, we have a quick 3-question